they used to play at the UFO club, and we used to go down there. You know, there were these kind of rather sort of mesmeric rhythms, you know, this endless bass line, ding da ding da ding da that kind of thing. And suddenly you'd have Syd in there with a Zippo lighter on a Fender guitar, cigarette hanging out of his mouth, hair straggling in front of him, sweating profusely, just running the thing up and down the frets, giving this incredible screaming pitch of noise. And somehow he was very free with it. It wasn't something that was contrived. He was just going for it, even though they had sort of set songs. But he was just letting go, doing what he wanted to do. He was a free spirit with it.
How did you get to know Syd in the beginning?
I was at school near Cambridge, and at about the age of 16, early 17, I left school and moved into Cambridge. And I moved into a house called on the corner of Clarendon Street and Earl Street. And this was a house of ill repute, full of dope smokers and dope fiends. And through that, I met Syd, and we became very close friends. We became like brothers. At the time, we looked alike even, and people sometimes thought we were brothers. And I liked to dabble with the guitar, and he was playing in bands. But in the holidays, we'd often get together and play guitar together and just jam. But, you know, so did you could jam with Dave Gilmour down by the mill pond with Syd Barrett. You know, it was all that kind of free spirit thing at the time. It wasn't something that was structured. And so we became close friends.
What sort of age were you then?
17. We were about 17. One of the things I remember distinctly about Syd was that he lived at his mother's house, and he had a room in the front of the house. And I often used to go around there for tea and a smoke and stuff, you know. And I always remember he was building, and he had suspended from the ceiling these incredibly complex duodecahedrons made out of wood, balsa wood, and painted. Dozens of them, all around the room, hanging at head height, different shapes. And the rest of the room was in absolute chaos, as were the other rooms that he lived in his life, I think. But what struck me was that in the middle of this kind of chaotic, you know, teenager's room, there were these incredibly precise, beautifully made, very difficully constructed objects. And I suddenly had a thought the other day that it almost sort of represented Syd in a way, something that was so beautifully built in a chaotic world. And it kind of, I've always thought about that. I think it was the summer of around about 66, 67, and Pink Floyd needed a roadie, and I'd just been fired from my job. And I had a minivan, and that tells you the state of rock and roll at the time. And I carried all the lights around the country for them. But what became most apparent within Pink Floyd, there was two very definitive sides to it. This was the psychedelic group, but they weren't the psychedelic group. One side was into drugs, Syd particularly, and yet Roger and Nick, it was a bottle of scotch. And it was very apparent while I was on the road that you know, the term psychedelic did not really apply in that sense, although everybody used it to describe the group.
So it's a kind of split culture.
It was a split culture, yeah. And I think one of the things that actually kept Pink Floyd together when Syd started to go off the rails was the fact that you had Roger and Nick particularly, who sort of had a focus on it because they didn't get too involved in the drug scene. Whereas once Syd started to go out of that into his own realms and doing his own thing, you know, there was no hope for the band and no hope for him in it. But having said that, I think that the writing that Syd did was not promoted by drugs or anything like that. Because before Syd started to become strange, he was already writing wonderful poetic songs. So I think, if anything, the drugs diminished his abilities, whereas with Roger, having watched what happened to Syd, he was able to sort of cultivate that. And in fact, when you look at Shine On You Crazy Diamond or, you know, other parts of Wish You Were Here, they've definitely come from his experiences of working with a stoned out guy, Syd. So yeah, there were two definitive things. One which was very much more, I think, organised, materially based, sensible, and the other which was heading off the rails. I remember he had another room in London when he was at art school in London. He was at Camberwell, and he had a room in Tottenham Street. And I always remember saying to him, when I had nowhere to crash in London, I said, Can I stay the night at your place? Sure, here's the key. I remember going round there, and I was absolutely appalled at the state of it. It was chaotic, absolutely chaotic. And I thought, how the hell can the guy live in this place? And again, somehow, out of this mayhem, Syd was somehow focused in what he was doing, which was writing songs at the time. He was writing those early Pink Floyd tunes right at that time. Syd was just part of that whole sort of drug culture that was experimenting. Everybody was experimenting. We didn't know what we were doing. You don't have drug information like you do now. Now, if you take LSD or MDA or ecstasy or whatever it is, even if you're irresponsible, you know what it is you're taking, or you can find out. In those days, nobody really had a clue. You know, there was a couple of guys on the west coast of America, Owsley and Ken Kesey and your Timothy Leary and you know, all these kind of people, you know, we heard about and occasionally saw and stuff, but they were experimenting too. So nobody was in control. Nobody knew how to deal with these kind of things. And when Syd started to experiment, yes, he was liberated in a way. He found some freedom of expression and wrote some wonderful tunes. But the truth of the matter for me is that the drugs simply didn't agree with his personality, and basically they tipped him over the edge and completely fucked up that ability, that freedom, that inner sight, and destroyed him. You know, he was unable to do it anymore, and that was a tragedy. So I remember being in Earlham Street, in his flat there, and he was pottering about and used to sit around and play the guitar, and we were playing some Who songs or something like that, and he was smoking a joint, and I think they were doing a gig that night at the UFO Club, the Pink Floyd one. And I always remember that he was sitting there and strumming, and this was Syd, my friend, who was about to be a pop star and was starting to be a pop star. He started to do Top of the Pops and things like that. You know, suddenly he was changing ever so slightly. His clothes were all suddenly more glamorous, and the frilly shirts were there. And then they went off to America. And the Pink Floyd did their first tour of America. And when he came back, he was different, completely different. I could not relate to him. We could not have a conversation in the normal sense of the word. And it wasn't just one day that you couldn't have a normal conversation and the next day it'd be all right. It was never all right after that. You don't know how to help him. And various people had tried to help him, but it was a time when there weren't therapists on every corner. There weren't counsellors available in the yellow pages. We were all taking drugs, and we were afraid ourselves. We didn't want to become like him, you know, and people would get the horrors rubbed off on them, and it was like, don't touch him. So in a way, we were all responsible for the way that Syd, you know, we just didn't know what to do about it, basically. Obviously, people like Andrew King and Peter Jenner, they were managers of this guy. They wanted him to do well. They wanted to see him blossom, to explore all the untapped, wonderful songs that he had inside him. And they wanted to see him get better. But somehow, no matter who was consulted, nobody could do anything about it. I think it would be different now. If the same experience happened to somebody else now, I think there would be the possibility of people being helped and saved from this spiral, downhill spiral, but not them.
Do you think the other members of the band were kind of unfeeling, or you know, were they harsh when they kicked him out?
I was not around the Pink Floyd in America on the tour that they did, but I do know that there was friction. I remember hearing directly from one of the other Pink Floyd about how Syd had sat down on the front of the stage at the Fillmore West, and this was the big Pink Floyd gig. This was the gig that was going to break them in America, and Syd just sat there and stared at the audience and just strummed his guitar or put his guitar down while the other guys played on. The audience, of course, being totally out of their trees, thought this was how it was supposed to be. But Roger was, on the verge of booting Syd off the stage and kicking him up the arse. He was so fed up with it. And certainly there was animosity, because basically Pink Floyd were breaking. They were doing great, and everybody else wanted to get on. And Syd was mucking it up. Syd was the spanner in the works. Syd was not playing ball. Syd was walking down the side of the swimming pool in a brand new velvet suit and falling in. He was out of control. And yes, there was resentment from the other members of the band. I mean, flashes of little genius that come from him. When Storm and I did the first Madcap Laughs album cover, Mick Rock, the photographer, was working for us at the time. We sent him off to photograph Syd, and Syd had said, "I'll do something special, don't worry about it." He didn't really want to talk about the photograph. When Mick Rock got there, he'd painted the photograph, the floors, red and blue stripes for the photograph. I mean, that's no ordinary pop star that does that. Most pop stars would. I don't know anybody else who has ever done that in my career of working in the music business. He'd painted red and blue stripes across the floor, ready for the photograph, and yet was very difficult to communicate with. So something inside his head was still working incredibly.
And some of those songs on Madcap Laughs are incredibly good songs. I mean, it's just amazing, sort of stripped down, some of them very on the edge. But, post Pink Floyd, he's still got that something.
Absolutely. Well, that's the very point I'm trying to make. This was not, when he painted that floor in stripes, this is not a loony who doesn't know what he's doing. This is a guy who has planned the photo session, so when the photographer arrives, he knows how he wants it to look. This is a structured, ordered mind. This is the duodecahedron in his room of chaos. He knew what was going on, but you try to communicate with him at the same time in terms of everyday, normal life, let's call it, in inverted commas, was impossible. Just impossible.
Go back to the good times, though, before the breakdown.
Well, the good times. I remember Syd standing on stage in Cambridge ballroom, playing his guitar, having a good time, singing old R&B tunes. Looking great, sounding great, enjoying himself. Fantastic stuff.